Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart and a crisis of the soul.
As the government shutdown enters its 19th day, we look at President Trump's primetime Oval Office address demanding $5.7 billion to build a wall on the southern border. After Trump gave his speech filled with falsehoods, Democrats offered their response.
We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage.
Then we speak to longtime national security journalist William Arkin, who just left NBC denouncing the mainstream media's coverage of the Trump administration, the national security state, and perpetual war.
I think because of Donald Trump, there's a tendency on the part of the mainstream media to look to the FBI and the CIA as institutions that somehow are going to save the American people from the president. The inadvertent effect of that is that they're promoting the very institutions which are the recipients and the beneficiaries of war and this state of perpetual war that we live under.
William Arkin on perpetual war and the creeping fascism of Homeland Security. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The partial shutdown of the U.S. government has entered its 19th day, soon to be the longest shutdown in history. On Tuesday night, President Donald Trump addressed the nation in his first primetime speech from the Oval Office. He urged Congress to approve $5.7 billion to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, but he opted not to declare a national emergency, as he threatened to.
Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs.
Trump's comments directly contradict numerous studies that show immigrants are less likely to commit violent crimes than U.S.-born citizens. Fact-checkers also disputed other key aspects of President Trump's claims about the drug trade and how his proposed border wall would be funded. Last week, Trump claimed multiple former U.S. presidents told him they should have built a border wall while in office. All four living former U.S. presidents or their representatives have since denied the claim, saying they did not have this conversation with Trump. After Trump spoke, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi delivered the Democrats' response, rebuking Trump's claims, calling for an end to the government shutdown, which will soon become the longest shutdown in U.S. history. We'll have more on Trump's address after headlines with Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianza Americas. In the Senate, Democrats have blocked the first bill in the new session, which included the controversial Combating BDS Act. The legislation aims to prevent opposition to the Israeli government by allowing state and local governments to sanction any U.S. companies which are engaged in a boycott against Israel. The bill received a vote of 56 to 44, falling short of the 60 needed to advance. Democrats say they will block the bill until the government shutdown is over. In environmental news, newly released data shows carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S. increased by 3.4% in 2018, the largest increase in 8 years. The spike comes despite a large number of coal plants closing in the past year. Researchers say the increase can be attributed to a rise in emissions from transportation, buildings, and factories. Last month, scientists said carbon dioxide emissions surged globally in 2018, describing the alarming trend as a speeding freight train. In response to Tuesday's report, May Boovy of 350.org said, quote, There are consequences to government inaction. Without taking critical measures to cut fossil fuel emissions much more drastically, we're looking ourselves into the devastating consequences of climate change, including rising sea levels, more severe hurricanes and storms, wildfires, and more. With a new Congress in session, we demand they heed these warnings and step up to act at the scale of the crisis. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is expected to leave his position as soon as the new Attorney General is confirmed, this according to emerging reports. Last month, Trump nominated former Attorney General for George H.W. Bush, William Barr, for the position. Barr is known for his expansive view of executive power and had previously sent an unsolicited memo to Rod Rosenstein criticizing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing Russia investigation. Rosenstein was seen by many as helping to protect Mueller from being fired and from other White House interference. If confirmed by the Senate, Barr will oversee Mueller's probe. In November, Trump retweeted an image from a pro-Trump Twitter account featuring Rosenstein as well as Robert Mueller and a range of prominent Democrats, including the Clintons and Barack Obama, behind prison bars. Text overlaid on the image reads, "Now that Russian collusion is a proven lie, when do the trials for treason begin?" Federal prosecutors are accusing former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort of sharing polling data during the 2016 campaign with a suspected Russian intelligence operative named Konstantin Klimnik. The accusation came to light after Manafort's lawyers failed to redact the information from a court filing. The document shows Special Counsel Robert Mueller believes Manafort lied to investigators about his dealings with Klimnik. The New York Times reports, quote, "The document provided the clearest evidence to date that the Trump campaign may have tried to coordinate with Russians during the 2016 presidential race." A Russian lawyer who was present at the infamous June 2016 Trump Tower meeting was charged by federal prosecutors with obstruction of justice in an unrelated case. The case, however, seemingly points to evidence of Natalia Veselnitskaya's close relationship with the Kremlin, which she has previously denied. Court documents show Veselnitskaya was backed by the Kremlin in her denial of money laundering accusations, raising further questions about whether she was working for the Kremlin when she took the Trump Tower meeting. The meeting, attended by Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and others, came after she promised damaging information on Hillary Clinton in an attempt to help Trump win the presidency. In October, reports emerged Russia's government provided a memo to Veselnitskaya ahead of the June 2016 meeting. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan condemned recent remarks by National Security Advisor John Bolton, in which Bolton said Turkey should protect Syrian Kurdish fighters as a condition for U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria. Turkey considers the Syrian Kurdish fighters to be part of a terrorist group. Erdogan, after apparently refusing to meet directly with Bolton during his Turkey trip, said he had agreed with President Trump that the U.S. would withdraw quickly while Turkish forces would counter the remaining threat of ISIS on the ground. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Iraq today to discuss the Syria withdrawal in a surprise visit. In Sudan, anti-government protests over the past month have resulted in at least 800 arrests, according to government officials. Among the arrested were professors from Khartoum University who joined the popular uprising. Dozens were killed during violent clashes last month as people took to the streets protesting the economic situation of the country and the military regime of President Omar Hassan al-Bashir, with many calling for the overthrow of the ruling National Congress Party. Al-Bashir is also accused of trying to censor news about the ongoing protests by arresting journalists, shutting down newspapers and websites, and disrupting the Internet. Los Angeles police have found a man's dead body inside the West Hollywood home of prominent Democratic donor Ed Buck. The deceased man's identity has not yet been revealed, but police have said he is black, making him the second black man to be found dead inside Buck's home. In July 2017, 26-year-old Jamel Moore was found naked in Buck's living room after he overdosed. Buck was not charged in Moore's death, but authorities now say they'll review their investigation. Ed Buck has been a vocal supporter of various Democratic politicians and causes for years and donated to the campaigns of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. In Houston, Texas, funeral services were held Tuesday for Jasmine Barnes, the 7-year-old girl who was shot while in a car with her mother and 3 of her sisters last week. A second man, 24-year-old Larry Woodruff, was charged with capital murder Tuesday. Woodruff is believed to be the shooter, while another man, Eric Black Jr., who was charged earlier this week, is said to have driven the car involved in the shooting. Police say the shooting was likely a case of mistaken identity. Musician R. Kelly could be under new investigation in Georgia days after an explosive docuseries aired on Lifetime TV chronicling years of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and misconduct allegations. An attorney for the family of Joycelyn Savage, who they allege has been brainwashed and sexually abused by R. Kelly, has reportedly been contacted by the Fulton County District Attorney. The Savage family says they've been threatened by R. Kelly's manager for supporting the documentary. The popular R&B singer and producer has been accused of sexual assault, predatory behavior, and pedophilia for 2 decades, but has never been criminally convicted. To see our recent interview about the docuseries Surviving R. Kelly and the efforts to bring justice to R. Kelly's victims, go to democracynow.org. In New York City, 2 Seattle city councilors warned activists and local leaders about the potential unwanted consequences of the new Amazon headquarters due to be built in Queens, New York. At a Monday organizing event, they said Seattle did not respond fast enough to Amazon's expansion, which left Seattle with a housing crisis as real estate prices soared. The councilors urged New Yorkers to resist an unfettered corporate takeover and demand fair labor conditions. Since Amazon's announcement of its HQ2 plans in November, community organizations and some local leaders have been protesting the move. Last month, workers at a new Amazon fulfillment center in Staten Island announced plans to unionize, citing safety, long hours, and low pay as some of their concerns. In Baltimore, Maryland, ICE agents have detained Salvadoran immigrant rights activist Roxana Orellana Santos after a routine check-in and might be preparing to deport her. Santos had previously sued Frederick County for civil rights violations and racial profiling after she was arrested while eating lunch on a curb in 2008. A Maryland court later found that Santos' right against unreasonable searches and seizures had been violated. Santos has been in the U.S. for over a decade after fleeing violence in El Salvador. She has 4 children living in the United States. Civil rights leader Angela Davis has responded to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's decision to revoke a human rights award in her honor over her activism for Palestinian rights and criticism of Israel. Davis says she was stunned by the move. In a statement, she responded, "The rescinding of this invitation and the cancellation of the event where I was scheduled to speak was not primarily an attack against me, but rather against the very spirit of the indivisibility of justice," she said. Davis will instead appear at an alternative event in Birmingham in her honor. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom introduced a health care proposal on his first day in office that would strengthen the Affordable Care Act and expand health care access for undocumented youth up to the age of 26. California's Medicaid program currently covers undocumented youth up to the age of 19. The plan would also restore the individual mandate in California, which was revoked in the 2017 Republican tax bill. And in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced Tuesday the city will guarantee health care for all New Yorkers. The plan's primarily targeting low-income and undocumented New Yorkers. An estimated 600,000 people in the city are not currently covered by any health care plan. This is Mayor de Blasio speaking at a news conference Tuesday.
The ultimate solution is single-payer health insurance for this whole country, or Medicare for all. That's the ideal. That's what we need. And I strongly support the single-payer bill that's going to be consider in Albany this spring. Because if Washington won't act, then our state government should act.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners across the country and around the world. President Donald Trump addressed the nation Tuesday night in his first primetime speech from the Oval Office. He urged Congress to approve $5.7 billion to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, but he opted not to declare a national emergency to force construction of that wall.
Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul.
Fact-checkers disputed key aspects of President Trump's claims, which he often repeats. On the drug front, the spike in overdoses is directly linked to the rising use of the opioid fentanyl, which largely comes from China, not the southern border. CNN reports U.S. government data shows most of the hard narcotics seized by Customs and Border Protection comes at legal ports of entry, not from people trying to secretly cross the southern border. Trump's comments on violent immigrants failed to note numerous studies that show immigrants are less likely to commit violent crimes than U.S.-born citizens. President Trump went on to blame Democrats for the partial government shutdown, which entered its 19th day today.
The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation. But the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government.
After Trump spoke, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi delivered the Democrats' response.
The fact is, the women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government.
The President of the United States, having failed to get Mexico to pay for his ineffective, unnecessary border wall, and unable to convince the Congress or the American people to foot the bill, has shut down the government. American democracy doesn't work that way. We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage.
As the partial government shutdown extends into its 19th day and will soon become the longest shutdown in history if it continues, Border Patrol and TSA agents are being forced to work without pay. To talk more about President Trump's Oval Office address, we're joined by Oscar Chacon. He's the executive director of Alianza Americas, an immigrant rights group based in Chicago. Oscar, well, I'm sure you sat down and watched the, 9-10-minute speech of President Trump, where nothing he announced was new. And actually, overnight, the New York Times reported he didn't even want to give this speech because he recognized that nothing he said was new and he wouldn't convince anyone else. But repeated, and because every network agreed to broadcast this live, every major corporate network, repeated falsehood after falsehood about immigrants and about what's happening at the southern border. Can you talk about this speech?
Absolutely. First of all, good morning and Happy New Year to both of you, Amy and Juan. Clearly, the speech last night was a repetition of the very lies that this man, Donald Trump, the U.S. president, has been saying since the moment he announced that he was going to be running for president. So what I saw in the speech last night was, again, a coming back in some ways, with even worse lies than before, of the same racist, xenophobic attack, very much adding insult to injury. Let's remember that this is the president that has been systematically attacking immigrants, attacking refugees, using lies to try to make his case. And I'm not surprised to hear that he was reluctant to make this speech, because in retrospective, they may come to regret the fact that he delivered this speech, which, as you said, and I agree, did not convince anybody about the merits of what this president is asking. Clearly, in my view, he was trying to use the very many failures of U.S. policy over many years to actually use it as justification to build a wall that anybody with a sense of respect for data, a sense of respect, for evidence, would agree, does not do anything in as far as solving problems, some of which may be legitimate. For example, the drug trafficking problem and the fact that there are a lot of people indeed dying in the U.S. as a result of drug trafficking has nothing to do, with the presence of immigrants in the U.S. And I believe that unless we are clearly in agreement that these are basically lies, supported more than anything else by prejudice, namely racism and xenophobia, we are not going to ever be able to get solutions to what is really a problem, which is the humanitarian crisis we are facing, where this president is clearly wanting to violate existing law, U.S. law and international law, when it comes to acknowledging the right that people have to seek asylum when their own countries have failed them in as far as protecting them and provide them a way of life that is decent and secure.
Well, Oscar, I wanted to ask you, even the basic premise that the president has repeatedly said that there's a crisis at the border, when, as you say, the facts, if anyone who studies the facts knows that apprehensions at the border by the Border Patrol are near all-time lows. Back in 2000, there were 1.6 million people being apprehended at the border. And for fiscal 2018, it was less than 400,000. 1/4 of the number were apprehended last year than were apprehended back in 2000. So there's been a plummeting, a sharp decline in the apprehensions. The difference is that many of the apprehensions now are not of single men looking for work, but are of families, of children, so that the system is not geared to handling and detaining families and children as it was previously, when it was largely single men coming for work. I'm wondering your thoughts about this idea that there is a crisis at the border.
Well, this is a classical case of trying to provide a medicine for an illness that does not exist. This is exactly what this particular approach by this president is all about. But keep in mind that from a strategy point of view, what this president is trying to do is to indeed get away with getting money for a wall that we don't need, and it would be an outright waste of taxpayers' money to put any money into it. But what he is really trying to do is to then, if he gets away with this, then say that the problem is not really the border, but that the problem is people coming into the country in every other way. Because in the end, keep in mind, this is an administration that when it comes to immigration and foreign nationals is driven by two principles. One is let's eliminate any possibility for people coming into the U.S. And number two, let's eject from this country people that we deem undesirable. This is what this president is really seeking to do. And again, he is using a false crisis. I repeat, the only crisis we really have is a crisis that results from the lack of respect for these people who are fleeing their own countries to be able to come into the U.S. and apply for political asylum and be given a fair hearing on the merits of their asylum cases. That is the crisis that we have, that is affecting children, family, and again, this president is simply ignoring this. Last night, the speech was a clear case of ignoring entirely what the problem really is, which he is actually causing or making worse. Because in fairness, it did not begin with this president. It goes back several years, but clearly he's making it a lot worse.
And also, I want to ask you about this issue of the cost of this wall that he wants to build, $5.7 billion. The reports I've seen show that this is for 234 miles of a wall. My rough math of that shows that this wall would cost about $6,000 per foot across the border. It's an enormous expenditure for a very small portion of the border. So even the mathematics of it don't seem to make sense.
No, you are correct. I mean, frankly, and this is why I emphasize that this is simply one piece, one element in a larger strategy that this administration is pursuing. I am happy to see that Democrats finally seem to be growing a strong backbone, and I hope they find the wisdom also to oppose very clearly this particular attempt on the president to again continue in a strategy that ultimately seeks to basically seal us from any foreigners coming in and make us basically able to eject out of the country people they deem undesirable. It is important to understand that if we were really serious about building a wall, $5.7 billion is really a joke. You would need literally hundreds of billions of dollars to build the kind of wall that he promised he would build and that he also promised that Mexico would pay for it. Nothing could be farther from the truth.
I wanted to play the response of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who also gave a response. I mean, the Democratic leaders, Pelosi and Schumer, did a joint response, but on Facebook, Twitter, Bernie Sanders responded to Donald Trump's speech.
President Trump tonight has told us why he believes we need the wall. It gives me no pleasure to tell you what most of you already know. And that is that President Trump lies all of the time. And in his remarks tonight and in recent weeks regarding immigration and the wall, he continues to lie. Just a few examples. Trump has told the American people several hundred times, and he mentioned it tonight, that Mexico would pay for the wall. That's a lie. If this wall were to be built, Mexico would not pay for it. American taxpayers would. Trump said that thousands and thousands of terrorists are entering the United States from the southern border. That is also a lie. According to a State Department report released in September, quote, at year's end, there was no credible evidence indicating that international terrorist groups have sent operatives via Mexico into the United States, end of quote. That's not Bernie Sanders' opinion. That is a direct quote from Trump's own State Department. Trump recently said that some ex-presidents told him that they should have built a wall. That is a lie. All 4 living ex-presidents have stated clearly that they never talked to Trump about their desire to build a wall. Trump said that we need a wall to prevent heroin, fentanyl, and other illegal drugs from coming into the country. Another lie. According to Donald Trump's own Drug Enforcement Administration, the most common method Mexican cartels use to transport illegal drugs over the southwest border is through legal ports of entry using passenger vehicles. And on it goes.
That is Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont giving his response to President Trump's Oval Office address, which every major corporate network ran last night. Oscar Chacon, if you can respond to what Senator Sanders said and also talk about what you think needs to happen now. And the fact that to accomplish what Trump wants to, he has shut down the government, at least a quarter of it, but included in that is Homeland Security. So as he talks about his concern about Homeland Security, the TSA agents at the airports, prison guards and prisons, the border guards on the border are being forced to work without pay.
Well, essentially, I mean, I agree with everything Senator Sanders said. I mean, I was saying pretty much the same thing before. I heard the recording of his response yesterday. You know, what I really believe needs to happen is a much stronger response, not only by members of Congress, but by citizens of the United States of America. We need to understand that this is a president that seeks to create crisis, that seeks to create chaos, to then use chaos and crises precisely to continue to feed the fear campaigning that he does in order to get away with what he wants. In the end, we must understand that, yes, the United States of America has been for years in a bad need for a brand new immigration policy. Clearly, what is happening now and what the president is proposing is absolutely no solution. We need to understand that the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that immigrants and immigration has been a true benefit for the country, a net asset in our nation, and also for their countries of origin. And then we also need to acknowledge once and for all that the policies that we have in place need to be brought in sync with the realities of the 21st century. Let me just give you one concrete example. We often in the United States of America celebrate when a corporation becomes more profitable because they move abroad, leaving people without jobs in the U.S. But we fail to acknowledge the fact that hardworking people in places in Central America or in Mexico should also have the right to be able to come and work in a country like the U.S. if they consider that they will be able to get a better pay in return for their labor. That is at the core of what is wrong with our immigration policy. We need to affirm the right of people to live in community with their families, because family is central for the well-being of human beings. These are principles that we must absolutely understand that have to be at the core. And ultimately, we also need to approach this from a foreign policy perspective. If we really don't want people to come, let's really work, to make countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, places people do not want to live because they have an opportunity for a decent way of life in their own nation. Until all that happens, I think we are going to continue to be just basically fooling ourselves, thinking that with building walls or simply funding more immigration enforcement, the way we've been doing it for the past 25 years, is going to solve a problem that, again, is real, but the solutions we have been so far talking about simply do not measure up.
Oscar Chacon, we want to thank you very much for being with us, Executive Director
Pleasure.
of Alianza Americas, an immigrant rights group based in Chicago. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the next guest just left NBC, writing a memo talking about perpetual war and the national security state. Its representatives are populating so many of the pundit positions of all the major networks. Stay with us. Wide Awake by Parquet Courts. Here on Democracy Now!, I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Prisoners of Donald Trump. That's how longtime NBC reporter and analyst William Arkin described the mainstream media in a scathing letter last week announcing he would be leaving the network, accusing the media of warmongering while ignoring the, quote, creeping fascism of Homeland Security. Arkin issued the blistering critique after a 30-year relationship with NBC, calling for Trump-free media days and a reckoning about how the network encourages a state of perpetual warfare. In the memo, he writes, quote, I find it disheartening that we do not report the failures of the generals and national security leaders. I find it shocking that we essentially condone continued American bumbling in the Middle East and now Africa through our ho-hum reporting. He continues, quote, of course, Trump is an ignorant and incompetent imposter, and yet I'm alarmed at how quick NBC is to mechanically argue to the contrary, to be in favor of policies that just spell more conflict and more war.
Well, for more, we're joined by William Arkin, longtime NBC reporter and analyst. His award-winning reporting has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post. He's the author of many books, including Top Secret America, The Rise of the New American Security State. Welcome to Democracy Now! So you left NBC with this explosive memo that not only indicts NBC, your network, says basically NBC, they might not like this, but doesn't stand out among the crowd of corporate networks in dealing with this issue of perpetual war.
Everything I said in this letter, which was a goodbye letter to my colleagues at NBC, applies to all of the mainstream networks, applies to CNN and Fox as well. So I'm not really singling out NBC. I was just most familiar with it. And my decision not to renew my contract was really one of thinking to myself that I wanted to stand back and think more about what we needed to do in order to change our national security policy. We've been at war now for 18 years. I don't think anybody could argue that there's a country in the Middle East that's safer today than it was in 2001. The generals and the national security leadership that runs the country and now also is the commentators and the analysts who populate the news media really are not people who we can look to as saying, wow, they won a war, they avoided a war, they achieved some magnificent objective. In fact, they are the custodians and the architects of perpetual warfare. And it seemed to me like there needed to be both a different voice and a solution. And I want to step back myself and think about how we can end this era of perpetual war and how we can build some real security both in the United States and abroad.
I'm wondering, in terms of your concerns about the coverage of President Trump and of the Trump era, and your concern about the fixation, and it really is an obsession almost of all of the networks with covering him on a not just a daily, but an hourly, minute-by-minute basis.
Well, let me just say, I'm here at Democracy Now!, and I shouldn't bite the hand that feeds me, but you started your broadcast today making fun of the president and his remarks last night about the border. It's almost impossible to avoid. Donald Trump runs a circus. Every day he gets up, he unzips his pants, and we go, oh, my God, what is he doing? And then the next day he repeats, and we repeat. So I think that to some degree he sucks the oxygen out of the debate. He changes the discourse. And we haven't figured out yet in the news media, every part of the news media, how to get beyond that. So I'm not arguing only about the mainstream. I think everyone is stuck in the Donald Trump circus.
I mean, I have to take issue with you with saying making fun, because fun is the one word I wouldn't use. But yes, we did focus on what he had to say. The more the networks broadcast directly what he has to say, this is the information that gets out to the American people. And it is so critical to take on each point. In that case, for example, that immigrants commit more crimes than natural-born Americans, which isn't true. And it's absolutely critical each time those comments are made to counter them. But let's get to the issue of who populates the network TV shows, which is validating an issue you have criticized for so long and investigated for so long, the national security state.
Well, you know, I've been associated with television for 30 years. I've been a journalist for about the same period of time, but it's not my background. My background was in Army intelligence, and then thereafter I wrote books about the military. And I was called upon to be a journalist because there was a desire on the part of the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and NBC to have experts helping people to understand an incredibly complex issue, national security. In those days, when I started, we used to have civilian experts on the air, people who weren't former government officials, people who weren't retired generals, people who might be university professors or activists who worked in non-governmental organizations or experts who were associated with think tanks. Something happened post 9/11, something happened in this intervening years in which those people virtually disappeared from the airwaves. And we don't see as many anymore. And in fact, we increasingly see journalists who are the commentators on what's going on. Now, that's a tricky position because journalists are supposed to be unbiased, but also at the same time, they're supposed to be explaining to the public what's going on with inside information. But the end result of it is that we become shallower and shallower in our coverage, particularly in an area like national security. We've just become so shallow that we're not really able even to see the truth, which is that we're at war right now in 9 countries around the world where we're bombing, and we hardly report any of it on a day-to-day basis. So to me, the crisis is that we condone perpetual war by virtue of our lack of reporting and investigation. And then second, we fill the airwaves or we fill the newspapers with stories about the immediate and don't give an adequate amount of space to deeper investigations or what I would say would be net assessment investigations of what really is going on. I mean, whether we should or shouldn't withdraw troops from Syria, whether we should or shouldn't withdraw troops from Afghanistan, whether we should or we shouldn't improve our relations with Russia, whether we should or we shouldn't pursue denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, all of these questions deserve a high degree of investigation and reporting beyond the question of whether or not Donald Trump is a buffoon. And we just don't do it. We're just not doing it. And so to me, I'm not necessarily interested in prescribing the why. I'm interested in changing the culture so that we can, in fact, better inform ourselves about national security so that the citizenry can play a more powerful role in influencing our national security policy.
I wanted to expand on that. Back in the 70s, the old socialist economist Barana Sweezy used to talk about the huge percentage of the American population that owed its livelihood directly to the defense industry, right? And one of the things in your top secret America exposés is that the Cold War ended, and the threats, supposedly in terms of state threats, receded to the United States. But yet, obviously, the military maintains its huge spread across the world, and more importantly, through Homeland Security, the militarization internally of the country, as you point out, has gotten to the point where people don't even know how extensive the Homeland Security apparatus is of this country, and the number of people that have top secret clearance. So it seems to me that the number of people working for this apparatus has actually grown, despite the fact that the threats, the existential threats to the United States have receded.
Well, there's no question that the national security establishment has grown and it has become far more powerful than it ever was. But here's the change. We've shifted from the industrial age to the information age. And consequently, we've also shifted from the dominance of the military-industrial complex, if you will, to a much more insidious and much more difficult to diagnose information complex. So the advent of contractors, the advent of a professional military, which means that the military itself touches fewer and fewer lives in America, all of those work together to make the national security state more and more embedded within our society, but yet at the same time more difficult to get to, more difficult to understand. So most people would be surprised to learn, for instance, that Amazon is one of the largest defense contractors, that they're building the cloud and they're building the data centers which support the intelligence community and support the military. And there are other civilian companies that we associate with being civilians who are also terrific beneficiaries of the military's largesse. So to me, to diagnose properly where we stand today, the point of the Top Secret America investigation was to show the wild growth of all areas of national security and this new invention of homeland security, if you will, but at the same time to point out that it wasn't something that was necessarily segregated from our society. It was more and more embedded within our society, and that made it more and more difficult to analyze properly and to do something about.
So you talked about the people who populate the networks as pundits, and you've been a fierce critic of the national security state, or at least understanding who it is who is explaining things to us. Reading from Politico, former CIA Director John Brennan laid a super spook, they said, to be reborn as a TV newsie. He just cashed in at NBC News as a senior national security and intelligence analyst, served as first expert views on Meet the Press. The Brennan acquisition seeks to elevate NBC to spook parity with CNN, which employs former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, former CIA Director Michael Hayden in a similar capacity. Other lesser-known national security veterans thrive under TV's grow lights, almost too numerous to list. They include Chuck Rosenberg, former acting DEA administrator, chief of staff for FBI Director James Comey, and counselor to former FBI Director Robert Mueller, Frank Figliuzzi, former chief of FBI counterintelligence, Juan Zarate, deputy national security advisor under Bush at NBC, Fran Townsend, homeland security advisor under Bush, and it goes on and on and on. These are now the pundits. And so when you have a situation like President Trump announcing he will immediately withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and have the troops that are in Afghanistan, you have this massive attack on him that's actually led by the permanent national security state under the guise of pundits on television.
Well, I think that what you said stands for itself, Amy, but I would add to it that I think the real crisis is that when we have a panel discussion on television, in the mainstream press, and even in the mainstream newspapers, we don't populate that panel with people who are in opposition. We have a single war party in the United States, and it's the only one that is given voice. And so really the crisis is not so much that there are experienced government officials speaking out. The problem is that there aren't critics who are sitting next to them saying that you're full of it. And so to me, we need to balance that. And I think that probably because of the phenomenon of Donald Trump, let's just be honest about it, really what we see on TV now is former Obama administration officials masquerading as analysts who are nonpartisan, when in fact they are partisan. And indeed we see fewer retired generals and fewer retired admirals who sometimes are useful in terms of explaining the profession of arms and the conduct of military operations in favor of these political figures who have a partisan view. I just don't think the American public gets well served by the fact that there isn't a broad range of opinions on those panels. I want to see peaceniks. I want to see academics. I want to see historians. I want them to as much have a voice in terms of understanding what's going on as I do see a former Obama administration official.
We have to break, but we're going to come back to this conversation and talk, among other issues, about one of your statements. Don't even get me started with the FBI. What? We now lionize this historically destructive institution, and much more. We're speaking to William Arkin, a longtime NBC reporter and analyst who just left the network, penning a letter critiquing the network for supporting perpetual warfare. His criticism talking about the creeping fascism of Homeland Security. Stay with us. Déclaration by Catherine Needleman and Jennifer Lim. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're talking with Bill Arkin, longtime NBC reporter and analyst, leaving NBC after many years, wrote a letter that's been called the Perpetual War Letter, critiquing the network, his own and the others, for encouraging, quote, the Trump circus. His award-winning reporting has appeared in major newspapers around the country, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, author, among other books, Top Secret America, The Rise of the New American Security State. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan?
Well, Bill, I wanted to ask you about another mentioned in your letter where you say, as perpetual war has become accepted as given in our lives, I'm proud to say I've never deviated in my argument at NBC or at my newspaper gigs that terrorists will never be defeated until we better understand why they are driven to fighting. And I have maintained my central view that air power in its broadest sense, including space and cyber, is not just the future, but the enabler and the tool of war today. On both those issues, the question of understanding what drives the terrorists and also this whole issue of air power and the particular perspective that you have on it.
Well, okay, so we have a way of war, and there's an American way of war, there's a Russian way of war, there's an old-fashioned way of war. And when the United States engages in warfare in the Middle East and parts of Africa, as it does today, it does so in a certain way. Yes, it's true that there are special operations commandos on the ground, and they, in fact, get down into the dirt and into the mud with the people that we're fighting. But by and large, the American military is highly technical, information dominant, dominated by aircraft, drones, space, cyber, etc. It's not necessarily the tool that is synonymous with the enemy. So we don't do very well in those conflicts in a way because there's a disproportionate amount of lethality and force between the two sides. But more importantly, the American way of war is to be very precise, and that's not necessarily what is appropriate in fighting a conflict in Syria, if you believe that we should be fighting in Syria in the first place. So it shouldn't be surprising to most people that the United States, when it bumbles into these countries in the Middle East and Africa, doesn't do very well. And when we even try to teach our allies on the ground how to be better fighters, how to be better militaries, we make an error of trying to make them emulate ourselves, and that's not necessarily either what is needed. So we have two problems. One is we have a presence in the Middle East which has grown enormously since 9/11. I believe that that military presence in itself provides the stimuli for the creation of more terrorists. Everyone has said this since 2001, but it has really reached a crisis point today, because even as the Taliban were defeated or al-Qaeda was driven into a small number, or as the United States was able to maintain some level of security in Iraq, what happened was new groups emerged, new groups kept popping up, and now we see ISIS, we see al-Shabaab in Somalia, we see new organizations emerging in Niger, Mali, etc. So the net assessment of our presence in the Middle East, first of all, has to be, what is it that is about our presence itself that is the stimuli for the creation of both local and foreign fighters and their growth? And then second, what is it about our military and the use of our military forces that is inappropriate or not appropriate for the conflicts in which we fight? Now, you might not want to be in the Middle East at all, and you might not want to be in Africa. I could make a very strong argument that we should just get out of Afghanistan altogether, that there's no reason for us to be in Syria, that it's ridiculous for us to be fighting in North Africa, etc. But at the same time, when we are there, we're not applying military force in the proper way. So there's this sort of double analysis that's required, both the strategic analysis at the highest level, which we've failed to do because we don't have qualified civilians in positions of national security leadership. And second, this sort of more tactical analysis that the types of wars we fight, we do it in the wrong way.
William Arkin, how many countries is the U.S. bombing now?
We're bombing 9 countries. We have in the last year bombed 9 countries, from Mali, Niger, Somalia, Libya, and then in the Middle East, it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria.
You're not counting Yemen in that because Assad.
Yemen, yeah. So that's it. And previously there was some fighting going on in Uganda, and even as we speak about the drug problem in Latin America, there's military action that is taking place on a day-to-day basis in Colombia, Ecuador, some parts of Central America as well. The United States still has forces in Honduras, etc. So really the scope and scale of the American military actions around the world is far greater than what most Americans perceive. But again, let's be clear about diagnosing the issue. It's less and less manpower intensive. It's more and more focused on drones. It's more and more focused on air power. It's more and more focused on space and cyber. And so we don't see the kinds of injuries and deaths that we were seeing a decade ago during, say, for instance, the surge in Iraq. It's become more invisible as a result of the style of American warfare. And as a result of that, it's almost as if the national security state has the ability to do what they want to be doing autonomously with very little intervention on the part of this civil society.
And William Arkin, you also write, don't get me started with the FBI. What, we now lionize this historically destructive institution?
Well, there's a crazy collateral damage of Donald Trump, and that is that there are a lot of liberals in America who believe that the CIA and the FBI is going to somehow save the country from Donald Trump. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not a particular fan of either the CIA or the FBI, and the FBI in particular has a deplorable record in American society, from Martin Luther King and the peace movements of the 1960s all the way up through Wen Ho Lee and others who have been persecuted by the FBI. And there's no real evidence that the FBI is either is that competent of an institution to begin with, in terms of even pursuing the prosecutions that it's pursuing. But yet we lionize them. We hold them up on a pedestal that somehow they're the truth tellers, that they're the ones who are getting to the bottom of things, when there's just no evidence that that's the case.
And what do you mean by the creeping fascism of Homeland Security?
I was against the creation of the Homeland Security Department in 2003 to begin with. First of all, don't like the word. Homeland Security sounds a little bit brown-shirty to me. But second of all, it was created to be a counterterrorist organization, a domestic counterterrorist organization. And all during the Obama administration, we heard Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security, saying, we are counterterrorism. But since then, we've seen they're creeping into cybersecurity. We've seen them creeping into election security. We've seen ICE and TSA become the second and third largest federal law enforcement agencies in the country. And so now Homeland Security sort of has become a domestic intelligence agency with really an unclear remit, really with broad powers that we don't fully understand. And we tend, again, to say Donald Trump's Homeland Security Department. Donald Trump couldn't find the Department of Homeland Security if somebody set him on the streets of New York, of Washington, D.C. So it's not Donald Trump's Homeland Security Department. It's our Homeland Security Department. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this is a department that is really operating on its own behalf and out of control.
We have to leave it there. Since your letter on perpetual war has gotten so much attention leaving NBC, has NBC interviewed you?
NBC has not interviewed me, but I'm gratified to the responses that I've gotten.
I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest, William Arkin, had just left NBC.